Hello, everyone. Welcome to the very first episode of the Y-Axis podcast with my special guest, Armani Ferrante, neck deep in a cup of 20 Starbucks.
Yeah, I think we got a grande hike. Yeah, it's tasting delicious. How's it going?
It's going great. Calling in from Hawaii here. I can't complain. I have some organic Kona roast coffee as well, so I can join you on the coffee side of things. I'm really happy to be starting again. For those that may have listened to me in the past, I had about 150 episodes in a prior podcast, so this is a very heartwarming moment for me to be able to begin this whole process anew and to have not only just a special guest, but a very good friend of mine and my co-founder, Armani Ferrante, on as the very first of these guests. Armani, to kick things off, I'd love to hear a little bit about yourself. You know, this question's always a little bit tricky because it's like, where do you start? What do you say? But if somebody asks you, who are you? What do you do? What's your answer to that?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think I have a good answer. I think if I were to like walk into somebody on the street and they ask me that question, I would probably just say I'm a developer that works in crypto. That's more or less the short and the long, and I think sums it up quite nicely.
Okay, perfect. Well, I'll do a little bit more of an introduction. Armani Ferrante is the founder of Backpack, founder of Mad Lads, and he is also a longtime software engineer. He worked at Apple and he's worked at other crypto companies, as well as building the Anchor framework on Solana, which is basically what every single Solana company uses to develop at the moment. So there's a lot going on there. And let's go backwards a little bit. I want to hear what made you want to be an engineer. I mean, that's kind of now it's a little bit more of an obvious decision, but even when you were starting, like what was the drive there?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's hard to like point to like one specific thing. I think, there's a lot of stuff that I can like point out as like a kid or like in school that like attracted me to it. You know, things like, playing video games. I think like every programmer likes video games for one reason or another. I suppose it's the only way that you can actually sit in front of a computer for prolonged periods of time without actually going crazy. I mean, there's early examples of like, writing code as a kid. Like MySpace is probably like the most notable example from my childhood. But I think it wasn't really until I got into college that I actually started taking programming seriously. I was originally going to be a math major, and I took some CS courses, and I had some like, you know, some friends that were studying computer science. And I think once I started like taking courses and started like getting that real like visual feedback of building stuff and seeing it appear on the screen, it like didn't really hit until kind of until university. And then kind of that's how I guess I got started, and it changed my major from math to computer science, and I guess the rest is history.
And why math in the first place? I think that's one of those degrees that is very, very theoretical, very good on the brain, but kind of hard to apply in the real world. I'm curious why that you had a draw to it.
Yeah, I mean, like math is like I think the thing that's very attractive to major in if you don't know what to major in, because it's like this wild card major. If you like do major in math, you kind of just like switch into anything, which like kind of has evidence, I suppose, by like the switch into CS, because it's just like generally a good foundation. I think like, there's a good saying, if you like read math books, you could read any books. And I think that is like kind of the thing that made it attractive to me. And it was like good fun. Like, I think uh theoretical, like, mathematics is always kind of an interesting topic. And but I think above all else, it was just a good thing that would segue into other majors.
And I'm curious when you started doing these CS courses, I'm sure they start you somewhere. I don't know if it's Python, I don't know what it is, but what was it during these courses that made it click for you? Was it a specific language, or was it just realizing that you could actually sort of take things from your mind, write them down, and have them actually create something in the real world?
I feel like a big part of it was like the challenge, because you take like math classes your entire life, and like you math, whether it's high school trigonometry or algebra or whatever. And then like, okay, you go into college and you take like, some courses, you get exposed to things like, real analysis or, more advanced like probability and statistics. But it's all kind of like stuff that you've been exposed to before, at least, if not in a formal way, at least in an informal way. But I think the CS courses I took were like very new to me. And I think that was a big part of what made it attractive as a major. It's like, okay, this is stuff that I have no idea what I'm doing. It's like this, it's very difficult. Um, at least in university, I feel like is more difficult than the actual profession. It's a bit different, but I think that was a big part of it. I mean, I think there's also this like huge component of enjoying building stuff. You know, it's like kind of adult Legos is maybe one way to put it, and solving problems and all that stuff. But I think it was probably a combination of all these things.
One thing I hear a lot is, oh, I want to learn how to code. I want to be a programmer. I want to build things. I have no idea where to start. And people get lost in the sauce and then they just don't even start. What if somebody doesn't have the opportunity to, go to a good university that has a computer science course, but they still want to start somewhere? Do you have a sense on what direction they should take?
I think especially nowadays, like going to university is like totally not even necessary to learn how to code. I feel like most people have already had significant programming experience before ever stepping foot onto a college campus. I think there's just tons of materials out there, everything from like coding boot camps to like YouTube videos to just books in the library. I think though the most effective way for most people, at least for myself, is to simply just like learn by doing. Like it just sounds kind of trite, but that's because it's like pretty effective. And so I think a good way to start is simply to just ask yourself what you want to build, right? Do you want to build a website? Do you want to build a mobile app? Like mobile apps are like one of the big things that I first started building, like really in the early days of like when the iPhone came out and iOS was like just forming, like coding apps in Objective-C and Xcode and learning that whole stack was something that was like really compelling for me because it would touch everything, right? You would learn like front end, you would learn, Objective-C and like, and lower level C, you would learn like, databases. And like every time you want to do something, you have to like solve a new problem. And so I feel like having those concrete examples and that rewarding feedback loop of, oh, I actually built something, I like put it in the hands of people, they can like tell me if they like it or hate it. It's like a pretty good way to get started. And so I think you can start big, you can start small, but I think having like good projects that you want to do and that are exciting to you is like maybe the best way to get started.
And how much can you carry over from one language into another? Is it sort of like natural languages where you have the Germanic roots, you have the Latin roots, and that's similar trees, or is it completely different?
Yeah, I think like languages are more or less things that you can pick up over a weekend as long as you kind of know the fundamentals. I think there's different styles of programming languages. There's like functional programming languages and object-oriented programming languages and declarative programming languages, like Haskell, Java, SQL as like those three respective categories might be like good examples. But I think once you've covered like those big categories, then it's pretty easy to hop between them. I mean, there's different syntax, and especially with things like ChatGPT, it becomes so much easier to just pick up new languages because you could literally just ask the AI to translate from one into another, and it's like a 10 times better Stack Overflow. And so yeah, picking up programming languages is super easy, and it's kind of a cosmetic thing, at least at a deep level.
That actually brings up a really interesting point, which is like the new world of programmers with things like ChatGPT being available. Does this mean that people may not have to get as deep on their stacks of what they know for programming, or does it mean that it just makes their jobs easier if they already have those fundamentals learned?
I think the latter for sure. I basically think that the effect that ChatGPT is going to have is it's going to more or less eliminate all of the mundane and kind of monotonous work associated with like development. So like things like syntax stuff, things like translating from one language to another, all of the stuff that you would basically just Google how to do. There's no reason why an AI couldn't do it for you and do it for you like 10 times or 100 times faster. And so I think what it'll end up doing is place a much stronger emphasis on the core fundamental skills of CS. So I think like things like boot camps and those types of skills will become less important over time because like more or less, people can do that with AI. But things like understanding at its core, like how machines work and how to develop like algorithms and how to train machine learning models and how to optimize code and do systems engineering. I think those are things that will continue to be, at least in the immediate term, be not replaced by AIs. But I think a lot of things like web development, app development, pixel pushing, that type of thing will definitely be dramatically improved and make the bar a lot lower for people to kind of be able to be effective accomplishing those tasks.
My last question on this line is, I've been speaking to ZK developers for the first time, zero knowledge proof developers, and they're pretty deep in the hardware world as well. They're not just in software. Is this becoming more common, or is it just specific to these niches where they need hardware optimization?
No, it's definitely become more and more common, not only with zero knowledge proofs, but also with AI. I mean, a lot of you hear the stuff like zero knowledge proofs and AI are both similar in that there's like a bunch of mathematics involved. But I think where a lot of the work comes into play is like the underlying systems engineering involved for performance optimization. So like, for example, with AI, a lot of it's just like training on huge data sets. And it turns out, well, if you can just make the code run faster, then you can train faster. And if you can train faster, then you can make the AI better. And so like things like running AI models, but also zero knowledge proof systems, whether it's provers, proof generations, or verifiers on like, custom hardware, ASICs, FPGAs being kind of like a programmable proxy to that, is very advantageous, because a lot of this stuff, they're just huge computations. And so you want to accelerate those computations, and that's where the custom hardware comes into play.
Got it. And I'm going to take a little step back to what you're talking about app development. You were saying this was one of the first places that you got involved in this when iPhone was coming out. And funny enough, one of the first places you went to work after college was Apple. And I'm curious on why Apple. I mean, I'm sure there were like different opportunities you were looking at. Why did that one call to you in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a combination of things. I think first and foremost, Apple is just like, I mean, it continues to be this incredible company. But I think like culturally, it's the one that spoke to me the most. I think, a lot of the core brand and messaging still appeals to me to this day. I think it's also like why we're like, I'm like such a fan of like NFTs and the Mad Lads brand, right? Is because of this whole kind of, Apple-esque, tech, companies meeting at the intersection of tech and culture. And I think Apple is really one of the few tech companies that have able to actually do that really well. I think, companies like Google or Facebook or Amazon or Netflix or whatever, they are all incredible engineering organizations, but none of them are really incredible cultural hubs. At Apple, it's like so cool. You would see like, people like Stevie Wonder, playing at at the parties, right? There's like, Demi Lovato is just like hanging out there, just like singing, on a Friday afternoon. Everybody's like drinking Lagunitas on the lawn, and there's just like all these like really cool kind of musicians. I remember I was like I was talking to one of the designers during my internship, about like my project, down like in front of the HI kind of, I don't even know what they call it, the HI kind of like super secret office or whatever, where you can't go in unless you're a designer. And like what's his name, Steve Iovine, is that his name, the co-founder of Beats, the famous music producer, just like walked right by me. And it's like that type of stuff I think was just like really really interesting and like really exciting for me, not only from the perspective of like where are you going to work and like what type of stuff are you going to work on, but also just like, I don't know, as a human, it's kind of cool. And so I think that was like one of the main reasons why it was an attractive place to work. I mean, also, at the time, like building mobile apps was the like most exciting thing. It's something I spent a lot of time doing and acquired those skills. And so it was like a natural place for me to kind of get a job. So I kind of like knew a lot of those tools. And so I think that combination of things was like made it a very natural preference for me.
I think that's a really interesting point because we all use Netflix, but we're not proud and outspoken that we use Netflix. So people are really proud that they use Mac. You have your Mac headphones. Like people really like representing it in their day-to-day life. So I really like that point there. And something I'm also a little bit curious about, maybe perhaps through the lens of a founder or whatever the things that you went on to do afterwards, what were some of the key takeaways that you got from working in such a sort of established company right out of college that have stayed with you and have helped you on the other things that you've done?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think there's There's a couple. I mean, I wouldn't say there's anything like super like life-changing from it, but there are like a couple like things that I think about on a continuous basis. So like maybe the first one, which is actually super relevant to everything that we're doing with Mad Lads and Backpack, is just expectation management. So I've told you this before in private, but on my first day of orientation at Apple as a new grad, as a new hire, you're going in there to join like the software org, and you're in there, and one of the stories that they told us was the story of Apple Maps. And what was really interesting about Apple Maps was they were telling us this story from the perspective of expectation management and how they failed to manage expectations properly with Apple Maps because they launched the product, they had this big keynote, they were saying how it's going to be the next biggest, latest, greatest Maps application, especially when compared to like Google Maps. And it turns out, well, when they launched the product, well, it wasn't all too great. It was like very rough around the edges. There's tons of bugs. There's tons of spots in the city that really track or locate, a mess all over the place, right? And I think from the perspective of a product developer, like that's a normal thing, right? It's totally fine for there to be bugs and for things to not be perfect, right? You need to ship it fast and get it into the world and get market feedback, and then and continuously improve it, right? These things take years. You're not going to build like a compelling Google Maps competitor over a short period of time. But where they really failed and what they really emphasized on was where they emphasized was the failure in expectation management, and that it's always better to under promise and over deliver. And that communication was always like a super important point when you're at that scale. And I think this is something I think about all the time with like every tweet, with every announcement, with every video, with every release. It's like you always want to under promise and over deliver. And you can do this exact same thing, but with slightly different messaging, and it'll have totally different interpretations and reactions and responses from the world. And so the way that you present stuff is really important. And I think kind of like, riffing on that a bit, another one of the kind of very strange, very Apple specific lessons was the importance of just like presentations. This was maybe like one of the most surprising things to me, where, I went in as an intern, and, I was a programmer and I wasn't expecting to do anything other than like write code. But, it's like if I recall, I think 12-week internship, and the last 2 weeks straight, I literally I didn't write any code. I literally did nothing but prepare a keynote and practice it like every day with my team. And they would just drill me over and over and over again. And I would go around to different people on my team and give them a keynote. I basically gave like the same keynote, like, I don't know, 1,000 times. I mean, I'm exaggerating. It wasn't actually 1,000 times. But this is something that was really, really surprising. And they cared about this so much. The philosophy behind it is like the interns come in and what they work on are these experimental features and products that they don't know if they're going to actually make it into the next year's release. And so you come in, you experiment, you write some code, you build a product, and then you basically go to the like managers and executives at the end of the summer and pitch it to them basically. And that's like what you're presenting. And, depending on their reaction, they may or may not, be receptive to it, and it reflects, positively or poorly, I suppose, on the team that hired that intern, right? And so, yeah, basically just like gave a presentation. I think it went pretty well, but they to the extent that they cared about that. The extent to which they cared about that presentation was something I just like won't ever forget, I think, and I think that was a very uniquely Apple thing for sure. And so, yeah, I think those are maybe like two examples of like very Apple specific things. There's other stuff like Apple's like, an older company. I think their software development processes are like very different from, most, Web2 like Facebook-esque software companies, I think. But yeah, I think from an engineering point of view, a lot of it wasn't like anything particularly new or things that I hadn't seen before. Although maybe more of an emphasis on, the bar is actually maybe lower than you would think, and that really, things like speed and execution are really important as opposed to everything just being perfect. Because like, Apple has this like timeline basically for feature development, and everything goes into an issue tracker. They call it Radar, and it's basically used throughout the entire software engineering organization. And whenever there's like a new release, like for the iPhone or for the MacBook or whatever, they basically have a bunch of bugs or a bunch of issues, and your goal is to go from like 1,000 issues to 0 issues by the time of launch. And so obviously as an engineer, you're like, all right, great, you're gonna fix all the issues and you're gonna get to launch with no actual issues. But what actually ends up happening is you actually have a bunch of managers that are every weekly basically going through the issues and just throwing out issues. And like this might sound like something that's like really obvious to a lot of people that have been in large companies or worked at companies in Silicon Valley. But for me, as like a new grad, I was like, oh wow, this is super interesting. Like they're just throwing out issues. It's not fixed. They're just, like the criteria for throwing out the issues is like really funny, right? It could be this like absolutely horrible, egregious bug, but if it was like shipped in the previous year, they'd be like, okay, yeah, it's like the current release has it, so it's totally fine. Let's skip it and then punt it, and then that's like one less issue that you have to fix. But the moral of the story is just ruthless prioritization behind getting to the release and shipping at a fixed point in time, irrespective of whether everything's perfect or not. Because if you can work on something forever and it'll never be perfect, right? And so having that that ruthless prioritization and that kind of train model where you're shipping in September a new iPhone, whether you like it or not, or whenever they ship the iPhone. I think that was like another kind of uniquely maybe not super unique, but it's definitely a memorable lesson from the whole experience. So yeah, I think those are maybe a couple of them.
Did you know that you wanted to found something one day when you joined Apple, when you were in college, when you were doing computer science?
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely one of the big attractions to computer science is it's such an empowering skill where you can basically start something from 0 to 1 with nobody but yourself and your kind of own ambitions and your own drive and desire. And I think that was really liberating for me. It's like, oh yeah, I don't have to like depend on anybody else, right? And I think I always I think like from my point of view, I don't know if I want to work at a big tech company for the rest of my life. I probably don't want to work a 9 to 5, but like I don't know, Apple's a cool place, so like let's just try it out and see what happens. And like the likelihood of me leaving is like pretty high, but also I'll probably like learn some stuff and it'll be a cool experience. And so that was very much like the thought process going into it. And so like, did I know I was going to found something? I mean, I don't know, probably. I didn't know exactly what it would be, but I think very much have a like inner entrepreneurial drive that manifests in the form of being like a not ideal coworker.
Well, my follow-up to that is basically if somebody is a software engineer, if they're a programmer and they know they want to build something one day, would you recommend them going into a large established company like Apple to gain experience before going for it? Or what is your sense there?
That's a really good question. So like maybe without answering that immediately, I think my view on this is that there's 2 really good times to start companies, I think. The first really good time to start a company is like when you're really young and naive and you have a fresh view on the world. You haven't had too much pattern recognition, so you haven't really been trained with the biases and the flaws that are ubiquitous in the world. And if you start a company really young like that, whether you're maybe like in college or maybe you just graduated high school and you skip college and you do the Teal Fellowship or something like that, then you have a really unique perspective of the world. And you also have all the advantages of being young, where you have like an infinite amount of energy and everybody you have your whole life ahead of you and everybody just assumes the best. And so you're given a ton of chances and people believe in you and this like, and you have like a really pretty solid social network as well. Whether it's like a social network from high school or college, or just people wanting to be around you because you're young. And I think this is a really great time to create a company for these reasons. Now, the main downside is that you don't have all the skills, right? Especially in tech where, if you're creating like a simple mobile app or a website, maybe it's not super important. But if you're creating like, ChatGPT or your OpenAI, or you're creating Tesla, or you're creating, one of these like, larger, or you're creating like Solana or something, you're not going to create these things as a new grad, right? Because they're like really hard, engineering problems. And there's some examples, I think like Facebook's maybe the best example, where they solved a lot of really interesting like engineering problems very young. But I think for the most part, like it's really, it's really hard to do that as a new grad because you just don't have the skills. And so that's really the trade-off, right? So that's like, one really good time to start a company. Another really good time to start a company is when you're a lot older, right? So maybe in your 30s or even 40s, where you've had like a pretty substantive career. You've learned a lot of really good skills. You've solved a lot of really hard problems. You have a strong network of people you've worked with before that are also really skilled and respect you because they've worked with you before and they know you can get the job done. And this is a tremendous time to create a company, because I think one of the hardest parts of creating a company, especially as a founder, and honestly, the most important job of a founder is to do a single thing. It's really just to hire. That's the single most important thing that a founder can do. And it's like you're not really building the machine; you're building the machine that builds the machine. And when you're older and you have those networks, then it becomes a lot easier to bootstrap a company, especially in the beginning when you don't have. For most companies, don't have funding, right? In crypto, like the world's upside down, and especially during bull markets, funding is abundant. I mean, not right now, obviously, but I think it's generally really hard to get a team and hire really smart people when, well, you don't have any funding. And in order to get that funding, well, it's a chicken and egg problem where you need to convince investors that you can execute, but well, you can't really convince investors that you can execute unless you have a team to execute. And so this is like a really hard chicken and the egg problem. And when you're older, you've had these kind of life experiences and you've had like, a substantive career, it's like a lot easier to recruit, right? Like the majority of the people on the Backpack team are people that, that have come from personal networks, right? It's like, I think only like one or two people have actually came from external recruiters. And that's like not a coincidence. And so I think that's like one of the main advantages. And what ends up happening, and I've seen this a lot, people start companies in this awkward phase in the middle where they've like worked at a big company for like a year or two. Maybe they're pretty far out of school, but they're not so far out of school where they've like had an established career. And so they get into this middle phase where they don't have that extremely strong professional network, but they've also don't have that really strong kind of network that you would have from being young and naive and not kind of too influenced by kind of the inherent kind of flaws and patterns that are existent in the world. And this is a really hard place to be in if you're trying to start a company and you kind of just like go circles and circles and circles. And so I think, if I had to give kind of advice, I think I would say like be at one of those two extremes. And it's actually really useful to be at companies that are solving hard problems as long as you're learning and you're growing as an individual and you're getting those skills and you're growing that network and meeting interesting people that will be your resources down the line. And I think ultimately that's like maybe the most important thing for founders is just, I mean, networking sounds like such a like a lame kind of a loaded term, but really it's what it comes down to.
So on this hiring topic, what do you think is an ideal initial composition for a team? What are some of the most important things that you think about when hiring?
I think in terms of composition, it depends on what you're building. I think it always depends. There's no like singular answer. And I think that's like why startups are so hard, is because like basically every single piece of advice that you'll hear for a startup is like basically wrong, because it is like very context specific. It'll only apply to like a certain startup at a certain point in time because it had like a certain set of people and it was operating in a certain industry and it was at a certain point in time. And that, I think that's why it's so challenging. But I think composition, depends on what you're doing. I think a traditional tech company, maybe in crypto, I think somebody said it on Twitter pretty well. You need like a really strong CTO slash technical founder. You need a really good somebody who's really good at Twitter. And then I forgot what the third. It's like a deranged Twitter addict, I think was the term. And then a really good designer. I mean, I don't think that's necessarily the recipe for all companies, but I think that's like a pretty good example of like you want a good mix of things. I think, yeah, I think it depends, but I think that's like a good kind of place to start. I think, again, every startup's different. I think depends on what you're working on.
And what about what you look for when you are hiring?
I think hiring comes down to a couple things. I mean, the first most important thing is just, is this person a good person? Ultimately, that's the most important thing, because I mean, I've been at several startups at this point in my short career, and I think the one thing that's common with every startup I've ever seen, whether it's one I've been at or ones I've observed from the outside, is that every startup is more or less a mess, or shit show, if you want to call it, if you want to use that language, where you have all of these issues at a startup. You have founders disputes, you have lack of product market fit, you have like regulatory uncertainty, you have disgruntled employees, you have like harassment or people that have done bad things inside of the company, you have like politics, right? And there's like, you can go down the line with each one of these problems, and each one of them feels like existential and like the end of the world when you're inside of a company. And the single most important thing is to simply just not allow those, I like to call them viruses. We've talked about this before. Not to allow those viruses to take over the company, because once that happens, it's very hard to like go back and recover. And so I think the single most important thing is just a fundamentally good person that has good faith interpretations of people's actions, because there's so many mistakes that are made, there's so many challenges to overcome, and ultimately the single most important thing is to simply not give up. Just like, don't let the startup die, just like stay alive. Like, you could honestly like win in a lot of cases by just simply not dying. And I think it's so common. I mean, basically every single startup I've ever been at as an engineer has just like, I've seen just founder disputes across the board. I think it's just so common, or it's so common for like employees to be upset about stuff, or to back channeling and like all of these things. And so I think this is the single most important thing above like intelligence, above like existing skills. It's simply just, is this person going to be contributing in a positive way to like the emotional like equilibrium of the company? And I think that's the starting point. And then once you have that, then you can start actually analyzing the person. It's like, okay, well, this person's good, he checks that box, now we can move on. Is he a good engineer? Or does this person have the appropriate skills? Right. So if you're, working on if you're building a blockchain, then, well, you probably want somebody that's worked on databases before, or systems engineering, and you probably don't want a web developer, right? So you need to have the right skill sets. And if they don't have the right skill sets, then it's like, okay, maybe that's fine. Can they learn the right skill sets, right? And I think this is what you see a lot in like engineering interviews, where, especially for new grads, where you're basically just testing, is this person smart and is this person fast? Because those are the two things that probably matter most above above existing skills, right? It's like, basically like speed is everything in startups, and getting to a correct answer, even if it means like twists and turns and a couple wrong answers along the way, is and getting there as fast as possible is probably the other thing, right? So it's like kind of a mix of all these things, right? It's like, are you a good person? Do you have the right skill sets? If you don't have the right skill sets, are you super smart? If you're, and can you move really quickly? And I think those are like kind of the foundational components. And then once you start like building out a team, I think you have it's good to like balance the team structure a bit and get different types of people. But I think at the beginning, those are probably the most important things to optimize for.
So a question I see quite a bit from non-technical people, because I think engineers market fit is somewhat straightforward, as you said, like you can assess it quite quickly. But from, you're a CEO, you're also an engineer yourself. How do you look at non-engineering skills and assess them? What are things that you think are quite valuable and needed for companies to be able to move forward positively?
Oh, it's super hard. It's super hard, but super important. I think it depends on the role as well, right? I think, you know, there are, there are deal makers, there are negotiators, like there are people that just like make stuff happen, right? The first name that comes to my mind is like Saeed, right? Like Saeed, just like a really good example of somebody that is such a net positive and such a strong non-technical talent that basically every company would be lucky to have a person like that, right? Um, and I don't even know how I would describe his skill set. It's like hard to put it into the words, right? It's like you just make stuff happen, whatever that means, right? Whether it's being like a really strong, negotiator, whether it's like, having like a really good personal network and being able to introduce people. I think that's like a really good example, but there's like lots of different types of people, right? There's really good marketers, right? It's like, are you really good at Twitter? Are you really good at social media? Are you really good at, creating presence for a brand? And that's like a really important skill. There's like really good operators, right? So people that are really detailed oriented, right? Maybe they're more technical. They're like a CFO type, but maybe they're more of like a COO type, right? They care all about the nitty gritty details of operating a company, right? It's like all the miscellaneous stuff from like making sure people have housing to like having the right office space to making sure the rent gets paid for to making sure that like expenses are being properly handled. Like there's a million and one different things to do at a startup that are not related to product. And I think a lot of the engineering and the product stuff is like what gets all the sexy attention. But I think this long tail of like seemingly infinite tasks that go into operating a company, especially once you get past the seed stage and you start growing at the Series A, Series B stage. It is also just super important. I mean, obviously it depends on the business. If you're at like Instagram or whatever, and you have a team of 19 people, then maybe it's not important. But if you are building like an operationally heavy business, right? If it's something like, like an exchange is like a perfect example of this, right? Where you have these like Coinbase and where they have like companies in every jurisdiction and compliance people and CS people and all this stuff in addition to just the engineers. Then these kind of skills become really important. And yeah, I mean, I think it's really hard to answer your question to evaluate these people. But I think ultimately, like the best thing that you can do, and this applies to like technical and non-technical talent, is to just look at what people have done in the past, right? That's not going to be kind of foolproof, but in general, it's like the best thing that you have, right? It's like, what has this person done that's been interesting, right? If they've won an Olympic gold medal, that's pretty impressive, right? If they've done like big wave surfing or something that requires a lot of effort, it's like pretty impressive. If they have a TikTok with 1 million followers or a podcast with tons of listeners, that's super impressive. And so it's like I think the question, especially for I think non-technical people where it's less objective, you can make the conversation a little more objective by just asking that question, I think. And then just if they can't answer that question, then just putting it on them, right? It's like, okay, well, if you want to, if you want to work here, right, then explain to me or show me why you're going to be valuable. And what are you going to do that's going to change the outcome of the company? Because I mean, the reality is that like talent is such a scarce resource. It's really, really hard to find really good people. And founders are desperate. They're like super, super desperate to find really good people. And especially if you're not like in a startup or if you're on the outside looking in, it's very easy to like think, oh, it's so hard to get in. Like, how do I meet these people? How do I prove my worth or whatever? But the reality is that people are so desperate to find really good people, and it's just really hard. It's a scarce resource. And so people are really open to just meeting anyone if they feel like it's going to help them, achieve their goals. So I don't know. That's the short story long.
I'm gonna do a pivot here, and I am going to go a little bit more into the crypto world, the blockchain world, and I want to know why you chose blockchains to work on. You worked on Ethereum, you worked on Oasis, you've been working on Solana for a while now. I know you are a very UX oriented person, which is not always what blockchains give you. So I'm curious why you chose this as your path of work.
I think, I mean, it was a combination of things. In 2017, there's that huge bull cycle where a lot of us came in during that time. We had learned about Ethereum during that time. I mean, I knew Bitcoin. I kind of learned about blockchains in school, but I didn't really become in love with them until I read the Ethereum white paper and this whole narrative of like a decentralized, permissionless, censorship-resistant world computer where you can like program smart contracts on it and do any type of application on this machine. That was really the thing that got me, and that was really the thing that I just like became fascinated by. And at the beginning, it was just like really cool tech, right? You would learn about all these cool things. You would learn about the EVM, you learn about Solidity, you learn about this is a Merkle Patricia try. You learn about the gossip protocols. You would go through like the code bases on Ethereum and kind of learn about all these crazy things that were being built, like a stable coins, DAI, MakerDAO, what's all this stuff. Then you start going into this world of like crypto economics. I think was the hot topic at the time, where like people were doing research on stuff like state channels and layer twos like Plasma, all this stuff that eventually became rollups. And it felt like this parallel universe where there was all of this like cutting edge systems research that was being done. And I think that was a big part of it. It was just like, this is really cool stuff, guys. Like, I don't know what this is useful for, but it's really cool. Like, let's get nerd sniped. And I think for a lot of engineers, that's kind of what happened. And I think like as time kind of went on, like it became as much about the people and the subculture that was being created. All this stuff like crypto Twitter and NFTs and all these people all around the world that are kind of making lasting friendships online because of these weird kind of decentralized databases that are connecting us all together. And I think that fabric that was more or less created through this tech was a really strong social force that evolved it from just like an interesting hobby or side project for engineers to being something that was just like really exciting and something that you want to dedicate your life to. And so I think that's more or less the long story short. It's like, come for the tech, stay for the vibes, as the saying goes.
Yeah, we definitely appreciate the vibes and the most important parts of all of this. And fast forwarding a little bit through all this time that you spent on these different blockchains and all the work that you did, you are now founding a company. You've been founding a company for about a year now, maybe a tiny bit more than a year. What is Backpack? What is Mad Lads? Who are these lads? What's going on?
In order to, I guess, describe Backpack, the starting point was really this idea of xNFTs, where the idea is very simple. Instead of tokenizing images like Bored Ape Yacht Club or degens or whatever, you can tokenize code. So you can have this record on a blockchain database that basically says, here's some code and it's owned by Tristan or it's owned by Armani. And that's like the very basic, simple primitive. I mean, you can think of this in a lot of different ways. You can think of it like WeChat mini programs on a blockchain. You could think of it like a normal NFT where there's an application bound to your Bored Ape. So like when you click on it inside of the wallet, you actually get the token gated experience. But this is kind of the idea behind xNFTs. And on top of this, well, we are building this kind of flagship consumer application, right? This is Backpack. There's a lot of different ways to look at it. On the one hand, it's just a wallet, but on the other hand, it's like a wallet in the same way that like an iPhone is a phone, right? And this is like maybe a grandiose kind of metaphor, but I think it's like aptly describes the approach, where on an iPhone you could call people, you can text people, but it's so much more than that, right? You have this rich app store, you have all these incredible kind of native user experiences, you have rich developer tooling, you have like unique device capabilities, and it all kind of comes together to create this like really compelling product where an ecosystem was built. And mobile applications are more or less the dominant way that we interact with the web. I mean, the web's still there, and you can obviously use it. I mean, browsers haven't gone anywhere. People use their desktops, but the majority of the world uses mobile applications. That's like where most of the usage comes from. And with wallets, I think with Backpack, we're trying to do something very similar, right? Where you have, a wallet, you can view your tokens, you can view your NFTs, you can swap, but you could also have these xNFTs, right? These native applications inside of the wallet. And you could build these native applications with all of these compelling primitives, right? So something as simple as like usernames and profile pictures in a bidirectional social graph, right? Where you can, hit up anybody on any blockchain, type in their address or type in their username and send them a message and bid on their NFTs, or send them, some SOL for paying for dinner, right? If you're a developer, you can send push notifications directly to a wallet and have a simple call to action for, walking by a pizza shop if you're, walking down like downtown LA or something like that. And it's all these things that like sound really simple because they are really simple, but stuff that hasn't really come together in a like coherent way in a crypto consumer application more or less until now. So I think like this is more or less the approach with Backpack. And so, is it a wallet? It's like, yeah, okay, it's a wallet. But it's like so much more than that, right? It's like, well, I don't know, it's Backpack, whatever that means. And so I think, yeah, that's kind of the starting point for the idea. And then, with Mad Lads, I think I mean, you were there from the beginning, Tristan, but the idea was more or less like, if we're going to build products for, NFT communities, I mean, there's community, there's hype, there's marketing, these are motivating factors for building an NFT project. But I think the fundamental purpose for the Mad Lads is basically twofold. On the one hand, there's, product feedback, right? You have an NFT collection. In order to build product for them, well, you need to have that feedback and go through those experiences of like going through an NFT mint, doing a whitelist, catering to a community, doing the artwork. It's like all these lessons that you learn by just like doing it, right? So there's that insight there, and you learn how to build product based on all that stuff. So there's some element of simply just learning what exactly NFTs are, right? And once you learn what NFTs are, then you can probably build pretty compelling product for it. But then there's like, on the other hand, this very intentional bootstrapping mechanism where I think what's interesting about Backpack is that, well, it's not all too useful if nobody's using Backpack, but it's pretty freaking useful if everybody's using Backpack, right? If I can like search Tristan and like send him some USDC and like, say, oh, thanks for the dinner or whatever, then like that's a much more compelling application than if I can't search Tristan and I can't send him USDC, right? It's like, it's a network effect, right? It's this common thing that people like to talk about where the app gets more useful the more people that come into it. And it's this chicken and the egg problem, right? How do you get people to build xNFTs? Well, you only get people to build xNFTs if there's like distribution. And a lot of people are using it, but a lot of people don't really want to use it unless there's unique experiences that can only be done inside of the wallet. And so there is this very, tactical strategy to bootstrap a network effect with the Mad Lads, where there is a singular purpose, beyond the community, beyond the hype, beyond the marketing, beyond the lessons learned from creating an NFT project, which is to say that we want to create like this organism that grows and grows and grows until eventually it hits this critical mass of a value where people can, use Backpack and use it in the same way that they use their Telegram or their Discord, or their Facebook or their Twitter or any of these other network-based, Web2 applications, but where you can do it with crypto and everything that comes along with that.
So there are two types of xNFTs. There are these xNFTs that are like apps, kind of like the apps on your iPhone. Is that right? That you add them to this wallet, you click on them, you can use whatever application experience that creator wanted you to have. And then there's another type where you have NFTs in the same way you hold NFTs in any wallet, but you can click on the NFT. And if you have that NFT in your wallet, it'll launch you into whatever experience that collection wants you to have by clicking on their NFT. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the protocol is the same under the hood. It's more or less a different presentation of the same idea.
Got it. But for one of them, you have to actually own the NFT to have the associated application experience.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think like this is something that I kind of want to move away from, which is not the NFT part, but it's this like installing an xNFT to use the application. I think there's some examples where that's useful, but like that as a general design pattern is like maybe a bit of an awkward user experience. And so I think like, I mean, this is something that, would be useful to debate, but I think basically the model of like one NFT, you own it. And if you own it, you can click on it and use the application. I think that's the right model. And then anything beyond that is more or less can be thought of as like, a native application browsing experience, whether it's native on mobile or in the browser on the web.
And one thing you touched on earlier when you were talking about Apple was how Apple is one of these very rare companies who have been able to figure out the intersection between tech and culture. How do you bring that to bear here with Backpack and Mad Lads?
Mad Lads is certainly emulating that approach, where on the one hand you have tech, you have Backpack, you have a high quality tech oriented engineering team that's trying to build compelling crypto product and solve important UX and problems to make crypto accessible to the entire world. But then on the other hand, you have the Mad Lads, right, where you have this rich kind of cultural hub of all of these people all around the world that all identify behind this decentralized brand that kind of represents their online identity and represents a lot of how they emotionally feel and look and take take influence on how they should be approaching the world, right? And this brand that's built out of this kind of rich heterogeneous like group of people, whether it's like the memes or the content creators or the messages and the productions and the storytelling produced by our team. And I think all that stuff kind of comes together to create this like really magnificent, I don't know, brand identity. I don't know how else to put it. That can only really be kind of expressed through the primitives that crypto gives you. And I think that's like a really special thing. And so yeah, these two things kind of come together where you have this like product company on the one hand, and you have this decentralized cultural hub on the other hand, and they kind of grow together where the product company builds for that brand and that brand helps give feedback and helps grow that product. And it's kind of this yin and the yang where they're not necessarily opposites, but they certainly help each other achieve their goals.
Is there anything you're particularly looking forward that you have down the pipeline at the moment? Anything that you're really excited for?
There's definitely a lot of stuff I'm really excited for. Some stuff that one lesson from Apple is giving people, it's like the value of giving people that feeling of Christmas morning surprise. And so I think like that's something I struggle with a bit with our own kind of product launches and releases. And so a lot of the stuff I'm excited for, I think falls into that category. But there's like smaller things that we're public and not so secretive about. I think like super excited for something as small as the mobile app. I mean, it's not necessarily small, but I think that's probably like the biggest thing. Super excited to continue to build flexible primitives for backpacks so that other L1s can like hook up into it. I think like Bitcoin and ordinals have really been on the top of people's mind recently, and so would love to kind of be able to work that type of stuff into the product. I'm super excited in general for like a lot of the stuff that's happening on Solana right now. I mean, it's not really backpack specific, but just as a member of the developer ecosystem there, I think there's a lot of really cool stuff, everything from like token 22 to privacy preserving stuff like Elusive to Fire Dancer and all that stuff there to like stuff like the games and the Arc protocol, the stuff that DevRel's been working on. The resurgence of DeFi, I think, is something that we're waiting for on Solana that I fully expect to happen. There's a lot to be excited about on the network. So yeah, I think there's a lot to look forward to.
Awesome. And my last question for you is you've now been a founder for a little bit over a year. Are there any particular sort of lessons learned on this journey or things that have stood out very strongly to you so far that you think could be potentially helpful to others or something that could help focus them?
I think of all of the things. I mean, there's lots of startup advice. There's product advice. There's product market fit, search advice. But I think of all of the things, the one thing that I think I constantly come back to is simply just learning how to deal with, I don't know how to describe it other than pain. Because it manifests itself in multiple forms, right? It's like there's so many things that go wrong. Like, maybe the best example for us like is like, FTX collapsing and us having like a large part of our treasury there, right? That was like maybe such, I think the majority of people would have just like tapped out and quit at that point. I think there's definitely like that was definitely a temptation. But there's like stuff like this that comes up all of the time, and every startup deals with it. And I think the single thing I would just say, just simply just like not giving up is like literally like half the battle, I feel. I mean, I don't know. We're not like through the weeds yet. We're like, if there's a very good chance. I mean, the probability is higher than not that like Backpack is a total failure. But that's just like the name of the game, right? I mean, we don't think that's going to be the case. We think our odds are pretty high. We think we're doing a good job. We're working 24/7 to make that happen. But like statistically speaking, like the odds of failure are much higher than the odds of success. And I think one way to significantly increase those odds is simply to just embrace the, I don't know, embrace the pain and just keep going.
I think those are very, very useful words for a lot of people, and just keep grinding on. And that our limits are much more than we expect them to be. And sometimes we can keep going past what we thought our limits were. So I just really want to say thank you for coming on this podcast. It's been a wonderful first episode, and thanks for setting me off on this pathway again to keep doing these. I appreciate it.
Yeah, this is awesome. I'm honored to be the first guest. So here's to many more.
To many more.